is Professor K.G. Subramanian. And we plan to have year-long centenary birthday celebration of Professor K.G. Subramanian. Usually we do this kind of event every year on 5th of February. And since this is birthday centenary, so we have planned to organize a lot of workshops, seminars, exhibitions, and various events on Manida and Manida's contribution towards contemporary art in India, and also the way he has shown the paths of contemporary art practice in Kala Bhavan and as a whole in Vishwa Bharati. We are very happy to get Shibda, our dear Shibda. He was my teacher and also teacher of many of our students who are present here, and also many faculty members of Kala Bhavan. Professor R. Sivakumar taught in Kala Bhavan for nearly 40 years, from 1981 to 2021. It's a long time we got him. As a student, I saw him, and also as a colleague, I got him. So we are very proud to get him here today, and he will have kind of illustrated talk on Manida's contribution in Kala Bhavan and also as a whole in Indian contemporary art. After that, actually, Ranjani Ramachandran from Sangeet Bhavan was supposed to come to perform, but she couldn't come because of her ill health. And in that place, we have got some young students from Sangeet Bhavan to perform. So we are very glad that some students suddenly accepted our invitation and they are here to perform. And it will be followed by another very renowned sitar player, Professor Shobhasati Sarkar. So he is also going to come soon to present performance. And I'm very happy to be here, but we are missing our principal, Professor Sanjay Mollik, supposed to come here and introduce the whole program. He was very happy to do that, but unfortunately, because of his health problem, so he just messaged me and he apologized for not being part of this program today. So we are very sorry for that. Now I will request our students to have the inaugural song of this inaugural program of centenary, birth centenary celebration of Professor K.G. Subramanian.
আকাশ জুড়ে শুনিনু ওই
Now I will request our dear Shivda to say a few words about Manida and his works.
Good evening, everyone. Uh, Thank you very much for asking me to be here today. It's an important moment for everyone who had known Manida and had the good fortune of interacting with him, learning from him. He was a great exemplar for many artists, artist teachers. He filled the Indian art scene for over 7 decades as a teacher, artist, designer, and much more. And I'm happy that I have been asked to start off the year-long celebrations in a way, because there are many here who knew him as well as I did, who can probably speak on him with authority and with flourish. But I suppose it was an act of kindness to someone who just retired to come back and do these honors. So, Manida left us about less than 8 years ago. So it's a centenary, but it's not a long time after uh, he passed away. So there are many, I mean, even maybe a few in the students who might have known him, met him, seen him. But there are also many who probably entered the art scene or art colleges, came here after that. And so she should have said that I'd better show some slides of his work as well. So if I slightly exceed the time that is allotted to me, that is his fault, not mine. So, yeah. So, to begin with a little bit of his background, he was born, as I'm sure by now all of you know, in northern part of Kerala, and in a place called Kalpati. Now, this is an interesting place because he himself belongs to a community of Tamil Brahmin settlers who came to Kerala maybe in the 14th, 15th century. And they stayed in 2 or 3 parts of Kerala. And one of the most important places where they settled was Kalpati. And they had small communities which in Malayalam and Tamil we call agraharams. So they had a long street. I mean, on both sides there were houses and they settled. So it's a very interesting place. But it's also interesting because this meant that he belonged to 2 cultures in some sense. That is, there was the world of Malayalam speakers around, but the Tamil settlers spoke at home in Tamil. So there was a small marginalized community within a larger community, which also meant they had not just 2 languages, but 2 cultural spheres they negotiated. Now this is, I think, something very important in his case, because one of the main things that, as we will see as he went ahead, is that is the ability to negotiate different cultures. So after the first few years of living at Kalpati, he moved on to a nearby place called Mahe, not a long distance away, but that was quite different again. Mahe was a French settlement, very small, tiny place. So it had various French features. Besides Tamil and Malayalam, people spoke French there. It had French officials. It also had various other people who lived. So you can see that right at the very beginning of his life, there were several communities that he was interacting with. And there was a small but interesting library, which you can still find in many parts of the state. And in this library, he came to know a lot of things about art in other parts of the world, including Shantiniketan, through the journals like Modern Review. And he also saw a little bit of world art through the French magazines that came to the library. So while he was still in school, he had developed some familiarity with art, kind of. And there were other art forms which were very much around and active. Kalpati and Palakkad, around which, I mean, where it is settled, was a big center for Carnatic music, and a lot of great Carnatic musicians came from that area. So music was there. His father was interested in music. His mother was interested in theater, and those were the days of traveling theaters. And he was an avid theater goer who accompanied his mother all the time. And then there were things like Kathakali and so on. And in a place like Kalpati, you had other traditional forms like Theyyam and so on. Now, so in a sense, he was being exposed to a lot of different kind of art works, some traditional, some not so traditional, and Mahe was also an interesting place in other terms, that it was a place where a lot of the early nationalists in that area gathered. Because it was a French colony, the British would not be able to enter there. And the nationalists took advantage of that. And there were many Gandhians, and there were the early kind of leaders of the left movement there. And some of them he knew. So while he was in school, he was already going to study classes where Marxian ideas were discussed, and he was moving to the charkha clubs of the Gandhians and so on. And in fact, he even got arrested while he was still in school. So his engagement with the national movement, the freedom struggle, started quite early. So I'm mentioning all this because all this had some amount of impact on what he did later. And of course, his family was a little worried about this young boy getting embroiled in all these things. So they packed him off to another nearby town and put him in a Jesuit school. So he might be kept away from political activism a little. But he took those opportunity to read up a lot of things, because that had a wonderful library, that place again. And he familiarized himself. Already he was familiar with what was happening in the modern literary scene, but those 2 years he did even much more reading. And then finally arrived to do economics at the Presidency College in Madras, where after a year and a little more, in 1942, he got embroiled in the Quit India movement. He was one of the student leaders of the Quit India movement. I mean, he was arrested, he was thrown out of the college and banned from entering any British art education institute. So it's only after he got banned from British institutes that he thought about turning towards art, although he was already drawing right from his childhood. And it was, I mean, his brother who actually wrote to Nandalal on his behalf, and Nandalal immediately responded by, asking him to come and join Kalaban. So in the beginning of 1944, we came here. And Kalaban was an important place. In fact, during those years already, he was moving, as I said, from the Marxian to the Gandhian circles, and then from there into the area of the larger issues of culture as articulated by Tagore. Now, he had started reading Tagore quite early, and he knew what was happening in Shantiniketan through the Modern Art Review. The Modern Review. The Modern Review published a lot about what was happening in Shantiniketan and seen drawings by Nandalal and so on. So he knew about Shantiniketan and he was quite happy to be here. And here, of course, as we know, he came into contact with three important artists, his teachers, Nandalal Bose, Binod Bihari Mukherjee, and Ramkinkar Page. Now, all these three artists had great impact on his development, his growth, and he held them in very high regard. I mean, he also helped, in a sense, to take their ideas ahead in post-independent India. Now, the artist who actually influenced him mostly while he was a student, in a sense, was Ramkinkar. And you can see that impact on his very early work, which he was doing as he was almost towards the end of his studentship. So there was an impact of Ramkinkar, which was the first strong impact that was there on his work. And then Binod Bihari. So he was actually moving from the youngest of his teachers, mentors, to the older ones. So you can see Binod Bihari's impact on his next set of works. And Nandalal began to enter his thought process a little slowly and a little later, but in very important ways, as we'll see. So his art kept changing. I mean, he went abroad to study after that, but when he was there, he was looking at what was happening in the modern world, but he was also looking at what had happened in Europe before modernism. That was something that he looked a little more seriously and closely than most other artists of his generation. And he was also looking at what was happening in other parts of the world, like Latin America. And you can see some impact of all of that in the way he used this medium of thing. And then there was, you can see some kind of echoes of somebody like Tamayo on his work. And this was largely within the framework of what we call what the modernist of his generation was doing. In the post-independent India, most of our, like what his contemporaries were doing. So he's a contemporary of all the progressive artists, and you can see that some similarity, I mean, not exactly in style, but in the areas of interest that we notice in other contemporaries of that period. But he wasn't very happy going that path. He was unsure if it has to be. He knew that in post-independent India, some of the issues that were very important for people like Nandalal, aggressive individualism and an expressionist kind of art that springs from it, that if that should be the way it happened at that point of time, 58, was he was invited by Popul Jacker to join the handloom board. And Popul Jacker gave him this opportunity to interact with a lot of craftsmen, weavers especially. And when he did that, 2 years he left Baroda, he had already joined Baroda, and that's another thing, that he was somebody who was associated with Baroda for about 30 years, helped in shaping that art institute, then came here in 1980 until his retirement. He was associated with this place. So both these places were very important for him. And I talked about, his kind of closeness to these three teachers who taught him and how highly he held them. And that was one of the reasons that why he left Baroda after 30 years and came to Shantiniketan when he got an opportunity. And when he was leaving, students in Baroda went to him and said, "Why are you leaving? I mean, you should be here, stay on, and things like that. And so he said, he told them that, see, Shantiniketan is a place where three complete artists lived, Nandalal, Vinod Bihari Ramkinkar. And that is the place I would like to go. Our students' excursions, a place of importance for Buddha. Somebody asked him, why are we visiting this place again and again? So Nandalal is supposed to have said, this is the land on which the Buddha walked. And it's a privilege to walk here. So this was the answer that he was giving his students. So in a sense, this place was very, very close to his heart. So these ideas, when he went to the Weaver Service Center, interact with these people, he thought we have to think in terms of a language rather than a personal style, which was what the moderns were doing. So he stepped back and he began to think about what kind of language can be built. It can be a personal language. In the modern times, it would be probably a more personalized language, but still a language. So went back, he started doing the still lifes, thinking in terms of how do you visually record a thing? How does the image and fact connect that? So he did this quite for about a year. He did a whole long series of things. There is an element of what we can call post-cubist. That again was a conscious decision, because in the modern period, if there was a major shift in visual language, it was represented by cubism, and of thinking in an alternate way of how to represent things. So that's the first step he took. And he was also trying how do you connect with issues around you, how to bring in other elements. So one of the things he did immediately after that, those still lives, is this mural in 1963 on the Ravindra in Lucknow. And that was the year, that was because 61 was the year of Ravindranath's centenary. And so the government had started building theatres in the memory of Ravindranath across India, and he was invited to do a mural there. So he did this terracotta mural there, and he took the King of the Dark Chamber as the subject. And you can see what he was doing in his still lives. The same language is extended in this mural. You have various little units which are geometrical, merely abstract, meaningless in a sense, but they combine together to make figures. They get together then to extend it to narration and so on and so forth. So, I'm not going into the details, but you can see that he was trying to move beyond the framework of modernist aesthetics in terms of just being purely visual, avoiding the narrative, avoiding, any contact with literature and so on. And he played around with these things. You can also see that some of them were individual units which was carefully made, others were standard units which he did and then played around with that. Now this is again part of the logic of post-cubist visual language in some sense. Now from those individual figures that we saw, he moved into these interiors, of course a kind of theatre, but a theatre where the narration is not very clear, the figures are not clear, but he was also, as many of the artists of that period in India were looking at what was happening elsewhere, because already by then the American abstractionists were thing, and he also goes there, in between for a year, and you can see the impact of that. These are partly painted, partly collages, and he's beginning to use various kinds of grid-like structures. Now it happened partly because in the the studio he had in New York was very small, so he had to use smaller units to build up larger pictures. So he began to use that, and this runs through his a lot of work, and you can notice they are much more interesting than his earlier things. I mean, in a way, animated much more, and then a certain way of using the figure and figure animation is coming in. The next thing he used was so the next thing he did was uh, uh, the 69 was the centenary of birth centenary of Gandhi. So that's
From the end show,
okay. Sorry. So that was the centenary of Gandhi, and again there was a public project which. So you can see he's actually got this opportunity in the 60s to do works on two people who are very close to his heart, Tagore and then now Gandhi. And he uses, again, you can see that his mediums are changing. The first was terracotta, now he is doing in sand cast cement. And these are all materials that modern artists didn't use very much at that point. And he really begins to work on Gandhian ideas like cooperation, the rural economy, and the harmony of religions, these three ideas, and he makes structures in an open quadrangle, and he begins to kind of bring them together in various ways. And you can notice here there are many things that's happening. There text, for instance, the idea that he was a staunch modernist who believed that there should be a primacy of the visual, but already he is also breaking into it with text and so on. So a kind of discursiveness is coming into the work, and especially in his public work, that is something very important. And the idea of doing public works and murals in public spaces was something that he really took from his teachers here. The same period in the 60s, he is between these two things. He also started doing books for children, making toys, and these were part of something like the Nandan Mela, which the Baroda faculty had. So he started doing all these things. So he's expanding his area of art activity. I mean, it's not always individualistic, it is not always high art, but he's also reaching out to other things. So each of these things would be as interesting, can be as creative and challenging for an artist as making his own paintings and working for puppet theaters where students would perform and things like that. And also did stages for a couple of plays, Tagore plays at that time. Now, having started working in terracotta, then he began to do these kind of terracotta reliefs, which was one of the innovations that for which which is remembered and which was very highly acclaimed. Now, here again, there is something that is happening. I mean, you can see there are changes happening in the art world in a sense at this point. 60s was the time the pop impact was coming into it. So, associates, students, they were trying to do that. Bhupen was there, BHAVAN was there at this point of time. And he thought about his own links with the folk traditions. And even when he went to America, he looked at all the, big artists there at that time. In fact, Clement Greenberg was very impressed with his work. He's the kind of pop of, modernism in America. And, but at the same time, what he was looking at were the individualist craftsmen working in the US. There was a very good, strong movement of individualist craftsmanship there. And he was closely observing many people and how they were using materials. And he was familiar with how Indian craftsmen were using materials. So one of the things is that he really foregrounds is that you don't have to use high levels of skills to make highly expressive images. You can use it make it with using very simple techniques and skills. So it was moving away from the skills but gaining in expressive things, learning lessons from craftsmen. This was the method that he was taking forward. And you can kind of dip into these traditions and produce very new kind of work. And this he did for quite some time. These set of things, this particular one, he did in Shantiniketan when he came here around 1776, 77, as a visiting fellow for a year. And this is the time I actually got to know him personally. These two works are from that phase. Now, while he was here in 76, 77, he also started experimenting with glass painting. The first works were actually done for Nandan Mela. And then he went back to Baroda after that and he started doing slightly larger ones. Now here again, there is something. He's taking up a tradition which you might say was a popular expression in the 17th to 19th century in India. And which was not considered very high art, but it was used in many ways. And at this point of time, probably only people were doing this little decorative things for lorries and things like that. They were using it, but the tradition had died on. But he's dipping into that old tradition. And another insight that you see is that if earlier there was this issue of language, then the issue of how the material speak for. When you do something like this, that is dipping into older traditions, and when you use the language of that tradition, something of the sensibility of that tradition also enters your work. So language, it has its history, it has its way in which it's used, the level at which it's used, and then it carries other sensibilities along with them. And he's able to mix. This is a glass painting, the traditional kind of glass painting. So I am just showing you these things to show what is the level of popular culture that he's dipping into. And at the same time, you also had where these kind of popular cultures would connect up with what was happening in modernism. Now, this was again an issue that Nandalal and Binod Bihari especially were very concerned with. So he's not following them stylistically in any way, but conceptually, where do languages meet? And what do that kind of meeting allow you to do? And you can see that if he started with things which look close to the tradition from which he's picking up, then he's moving away from that, adding to it in various ways. Okay? And when he's doing it, we can also see a lot of interesting commentary going on in the background. I mean, just viewing the works may not help you always, but if you know when he did it, things which are happening around, you will notice finds echo. And I'm ending with a few images of what he did in terms of murals later. This is the first version of the design studio that he painted. And you can notice even here he's taking things from what might be called the folk traditions and so on. So, but he's taking that language, those visual possibilities, and then extending it in his own way. Now, once again, we can say that he doesn't pick up stylistically the same things. It doesn't look stylistically exactly the same. But in terms of how does that language of folk painting work? How do you build up sophisticated images using very simple units. Now, you can see this running from his 1963 mural right into these. Or again, even if you are looking at high arts and dip into it, how can you create something which doesn't look stylistically very close, but in terms of structuring, in terms of the thought process, which comes close to it. And by now, his interest in language and the structure of language kind of takes a back seat. He is more interested in what is the expressive possibility that this kind of language allows. So the correlation between fact and image is less important for him. In fact, if the cubists were more, he felt more interesting when in the late 50s, early 60s. Now, he probably would align more with the expressionists who use that, not his own contemporary expressionists, but expressionists in the larger kind of thing, where the fact-image correlation is kind of dealt with greater freedom for expressive reasons. The way colors would relate to planes and things like that, you are making a kind of big shift in those things. So these are his tables. But again, there was one more little thing I would touch upon, that besides the issues of language and art, which he was exercised about, he was also exercised about what was happening around him. You would not call him an activist, although he began his life as an activist, then became an artist. One of the last conversations I had with him, he said that he is not an activist artist, but an artist activist. And you can see elements of it running through his career. This first book that he did for children, it was done in '69, the same year as he did the Gandhi Darshan. And there was a reason for doing this. It's called When God Made Man, He Made Them Alike. Because that was the year in which the first major communal riots in India took place after independence. And it was happening around him in Gujarat. So this book was not only something for children, to be sold in the art fair, but it was also his way of communicating a message to the inner people, that we have to remember that there is a common humanity. Now, similar things happened when he went to Oxford. There was a lot of, hue and cry happening at that time about the Ethiopian famine. And this again, somewhat satirical kind of image of how the West responded to this famine. So, as I said, there would be periodically, he is also commenting on what is happening, or the riots that broke out in Bombay. That led him to do a series of works commenting on that, or the kind of later communal riots that happened in Gujarat. So he's not consistently turning himself into an activist, but he's always having a pulse on those social issues. And the very last one, which is something that is happening around us even today, the war of the relics, fighting over history rather than trying to shape things in the present. Now I end with this to show that when he did these works, there might be all these things, all these different concerns overlapping and simultaneously coexisting. It's great fun, it's a celebration, it's a wonderfully joyful work. But when you're looking at it, there are traditional symbols coming up somewhere, and that relate to what was happening at Shantiniketan at that time. And things, images which just is fabulous new mythology in some sense and fun. And the same would have a image of Durga, which is a commentary on how we are probably fighting each other and what kind of a shift can we make in that. So it's a traditional Durga image, but Durga seems to be fighting not with weapons but with flowers. And the same thing would have little witness of humorous events, two lovers, probably two young students, meeting on a moonlit night, and somebody else on the adjacent wall, probably spying on them or ogling at them, or he himself sitting at a corner of the mural, or an artist like him looking at the world around and painting it, one unaware of what is happening on the adjacent wall. Or little fun things which again dips into various levels of traditions, and maybe even very evocative little images in the midst of all that, almost as simple, abstract, like a haiku, which is actually lines which I took from one of his texts that he wrote for an exhibition. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Siddha, for your knowledge enriching presentation. Now we'll have a small 5 minutes break for tea. By that time, during that period, we can set the stage for performance. Please serve yourself coffee and biscuits just near the door.
ये बहुत ज़्यादा ही है ये सब